Hello, and welcome back to my studio. Today I'm going to be doing a mouse portrait on a 10 by 10 inch canvas panel in acrylics, and this is going to be an old master's style, so quite muted colouring. So I hope you find it enjoyable and get some value from it. So let's get painting. So the first thing I'm going to do is give the entire canvas, a coat of raw umber, very loose, very light, quite watery. And then with a large brush I'm going to start knocking in the basic shapes of the image. I've already drawn out the mouse onto the canvas. Now I'm just putting in the relevant dark areas. And it's a large 1-inch bristle flat brush I'm using here. So I'm using raw umber and only raw umber and white for this underpainting. So putting in, I'm just going to scratch in my name in the wet paint there while that area is wet, because that's where I normally put it. Now I can start putting in some of the details with a smaller brush. And that's like the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, and the hands and feet. These are the detailed areas, basically, that I want to show, and they have to be accurate. So I'm just putting in some of the highlights now with some white and this small brush, just very loosely. The accurate bits have to be round the eye, the nose and the mouth. They're the most accurate because that's what people's eyes are going to be drawn to. So they have to be quite real and realistic. And the rest is fairly impressionistic. So just putting in some little details here of the hands and little fingers and the arms and the ears. Make sure they're correct. But all the time I'm just building up the whole painting just with raw umber and white, and this gives it a nice old mastery feel to the entire painting. So with a little bit of white now added to that raw umber, I'm just going to pop in this background. Now it's really quite loose, but I'll go over this several times, let it dry and then go over it again in order to get that nice smooth gradient that I want going from light to dark in this background. And this is the way to do it with the acrylics. The way to get nice smooth gradients is to do several layers. Wait for each layer to dry before you do the next one over the top. It doesn't take long for acrylics to dry. So you see there's the next layer going in over the top, and it just makes it that little bit more polished and smoother. Now it's not right yet, I need to go darker in that background. Some of the darks have to go darker. But I'm just going to put in this little stony ground and stony floor and some shadow areas. And then build the body up once again. You see these little stones I'm doing, they're going to get quite detailed in the middle ground, but as they recede into the distance will get quite loose and blurred. So while I'm waiting for that background layer to dry, I'll just add a little bit more into the mouse itself. So putting in more raw umber, and the more layers you put on, the darker it will become. So those darks can really become as dark as I want them to be just by doing several layers. So putting in the shape and the anatomy, make sure that's correct. I'm getting those darks and lights exactly where I want them to be. So I need to put in some even darker areas and darker elements where to show the mouse is actually sitting and creating a shadow. So I'll put in some mid-tone now with this highlight area in the lower portions of the mouse. And the light is coming from behind, so creating a beautiful outline of light around it, like a halo almost. So I'm just reinforcing those now. And making the brightness of the ears stand out as well. The whole idea of this is to make the background throw the actual shape of the mouse out, so that it's not blending too much in with the background, but more like it's being thrown out, more contrast. A few more details now into these stones and twigs and grit and soil. Now I want that light to be a little pool of light where the mouse is standing on the ground. I don't want it to be everywhere, I don't want detail to be everywhere, just in this little pool of light where the mouse is. So I'm just putting some lighter areas in there. And just reinforcing that background again, where there was a little mistake there. So we'll let that dry, and I'll go over it again. So I'll go over it again now with a much darker tone, which is as dark as I want it to be now, and then a mid-tone to blend into that. And we'll do the same over there on that side. A mid-tone there to throw the shape of the mouse out. That's better, much better. Slightly darker, blending as I go, like that, and then a lighter one, a lighter tone, going from left to right and blending that into the wet paint that's there already in the background. You can see how it's created that lovely soft blending or blended background. So reinforcing this foreground once again and reinforcing the highlights, this time with a bristle fan brush, a very worn one, and very thick white paint now, because I need that to really stand out, but still being careful with the application, because the light and the white will dull as it dries. You have to reapply it several times for it to keep its brightness, and eventually it will be as bright as you want it to be. But each time let the previous layers dry before you do any more on the top. So just adding a few little detailed areas now with this small brush, a few little bits of fur, and I've splayed the hairs of this old brush just to create a fur-like effect. And I can do the same with a rake brush, which has lots of little points and which is fantastic for doing fur. Make sure the paint is the right constituency. It's got to be quite thin to work with this brush. Don't apply it too thickly. Although it is useful with thick paint, it has a different way of applying paint. So just making sure all that looks correct before I carry on with the other parts of the painting. So just making sure that those lights and that anatomy is correct there. Just put in some details around this muzzle and the highlights be around the ears, making sure that they're bright enough. Now I can apply some thick paint with that brush. Now you see I'm just going to put in some highlights of the feet because they become a little bit lost. So I need to establish those. These little toes and feet there, made a little bit more realistic. And I'll also do the same with his little paws, his front paws there, and little fingers just need to be put in with a little bit more detail. Like that. A little bit of detail in the eye, a little highlight in the eye makes it come alive. So get those hands just right. And little fingers. And the shadows, and that's just about right there. So I need to make sure this ear is correct now, and that one. And it has some very bright lights within it as the light shines through the ear. And this has a highlight on the edge, as does the other one. Like that. I'll make sure this nose is absolutely perfect and correct, or else it won't look right. The eyes, the nose, the mouth have to be absolutely perfect, otherwise it won't look right. So take your time getting this correct. There's no rush. It's better to be perfect with a portrait than not perfect with certain areas. So again, just establishing those whites again, those highlights, making sure they're bright enough. Putting in the toes once again. Now I'm going to put highlights on these little stones and twigs and sticks. But I'm only going to put these highlights in this little pool of light where the mouse is sitting. Because if I put them everywhere, your eye would be taken and drawn everywhere. But I want the eye of the viewer to rest on the mouse and on its little surrounding there, in this little pool of light. So that's where all those highlights should be. A few little straight lines here and there to show little twigs. And then go back in once again with the darks to re-establish those in the actual mouse itself. And the general shapes. Making sure that they are correct. The lights and darks are as light as I want them to be, and the darks are as dark as I want them to be. Like that. And I'll get it to a certain stage in the painting where I think that underpainting now is completely as I want it. I let it dry absolutely and totally, completely. You can use a hairdryer if you want to dry it off, but it must be completely dry before we go on to the next stage, which is the colour stage or the glazing stage. And I'm going to use thin layers of colour on the top, almost like washes of colour really, but they're called glazes, and I'll be doing those very soon. As soon as I've got this layer, this underpainting layer, absolutely and completely as I want it. So I will keep working at it until it's just right. It can be quite fiddly at times, some of this, but it is worth it to have this underpainting absolutely perfect. Knowing that I couldn't do a better job, it has to be exactly right. A few more highlights back in there just to re-establish them. In that little pool of light around its feet. And then that's it. Wait for it to be completely dry, and then I apply a layer or a coat of acrylic paint retarder, which slows the drying time down of the paint. So I use a mixture of retarder and flow improver, 60% retarder and 40% flow improver. Paint that over the entire dry canvas, and then using thin layers of paint I can add these into that layer, and it will take maybe 20 minutes, half an hour for that layer to dry now, so I can blend very subtly using a little fan brush here. Now once I've applied that paint, I can use the fan brush to evenly spread it around, and it'll look very smooth. I'm putting a mixture of cadmium orange and burnt sienna now over the top of the mouse to create the colour of the fur, and also the colour of the background, the foreground rather, of the stones and twigs and soil. Blend that in, adding a few little greys in there as well. Payne's grey and white will create some lovely greys. Blend those in to create a blurry effect in the foreground. And then give the paws, the front paws and the hind feet and the tail, a little bit of extra colour, because they are warmer and slightly more pink, as is the nose, which is even more pink. So make sure you've got that right, very thin, so you can still see the painting underneath. That's the whole idea. You can still see that raw umber underpainting, but we're now glazing it with colour, and you can still see those details underneath, but they're coloured. It's like colouring in, basically, I suppose. But it's an old master's technique that they devised hundreds of years ago, 500 years ago, maybe even earlier than that, and is still used today, and is a wonderful way of painting in an old master's style. So now I'm just putting in some of those highlights once again onto those relevant details, making those paws look a little bit more realistic, adding the highlights to those stones again, just in that little area, and little sticks, a few little straight lines here and there, just to highlight them. Not everywhere, again, just in that little pool of light. And each time you do these little bits of detail, the whole painting will become more and more realistic. It all depends on which level you want to take it to. I'm leaving most of the realism here in the actual mouse's face itself and its limbs. Everything else is literally quite loosely painted. So a little bit of colour now into its little belly, and those highlights once again on the toes, because it will sink in, this paint, that the lightness will dull down, so you'll have to go over it several times in order to get it just right. So establishing those really bright lights now. Now it's not pure white now, I'm using white but with a tiny little bit of yellow ochre in it, just to soften the whiteness so that it's not too hard and stark. It has a softness to it. So once again going over the stones, and now I'm going to add a little bluey grey tone into this fur, bit of Payne's grey and white there, and a tiny little bit of raw umber just to make it slightly more dull. And then do those highlights once again. I don't know how many times I've done those highlights, but it doesn't matter. Do them as many times as it takes for it to look right. Now I'm going to add in a few little whiskers, because all little creatures like this have got lovely little whiskers, and then they're quite bright there on this side because that's where the light is coming from and hitting it. And I'm going to add a few little extra little bits of fur just sticking out here and there. One or two little bits, and then I'm going to put some fur, or whiskers rather, into this side, but they're not quite so bright because they're slightly in shadow. And then one or two little unkempt little bits of fur here and there. And that's the painting finished. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching this video and hopefully found it rewarding and entertaining. Let me know if you have any comments or questions that I may be able to help you with. And I look forward to you joining me on my next painting video. So until then, have a lovely day and happy painting!